lecture of our PhD graduate seminar, which today actually is going to be a bit dense because unlike the previous chapters, which were focused on one particular author, today actually I have collapsed in one presentation 3 books. As you know, this seminar has a very modest goal, which is not to add anything new on these books, but to simply gloss them to see if they can propose issues or problems that in a way are still relevant today. And in fact, I have to say that it's a pity that I had to do this, let's say, grouping, but of course, in order to really have a rather even distribution of interest, the span of the seminar required that sort of concentration, so I had to basically collapse, in fact, 3 books which are absolutely important for the development of architectural theory in general, and especially of architectural theory in the 16th century. Forgive me if I will in fact give more weight to an author rather than the other 2, because I think he, in a way, for me, especially in the context of this, let's say, lecture series, he's the most important, the one I would like also to discuss more in depth. And this author is Serlio. And I will be very short, actually, on Vignola and Palladio. I'm not sure even if I will be able to. It's the first time I'm giving this seminar, so I didn't test yet the length of these lectures. First of all, it's very important, actually, to see these 3 architects together, because I think that through, there are more books produced in the 16th century that deal with the theorizing of architecture, but there is no doubt that these 3 books are the most important, which, and I have to say that this is really the moment in which books becomes the most influential tool to transmit architectural knowledge. And of course, for an obvious reason, which I think everybody could guess, which is the invention of printing, which allowed something that was unprecedented, the mass production of knowledge. So if, of course, books existed also before, as you can imagine, the labor of copying them by hand would take a very long time, and for that reason, books were rather diffuse, but the diffusion was pretty much balanced by this technical difficulty. But of course, the invention of printing changed completely the landscape of even reading and writing. And architecture actually is one of the disciplines, actually more than any other discipline, that is dramatically affected by this technological, let's say, invention. Because while for Alberti, one of the fundamental problems of transmitting architecture was the impossibility to rely on images, because unlike written text, images require a lot of skill and talent to be copied in a precise way. Of course, this was, as you know, the crux of Alberti, and the reason why he only trusted the language, the written text. But this actually happened just before the invention of printing. With the invention of printing, this problem was somehow not completely, because we will see that also within printing there is a margin, of course, of, let's say, interpretation and falsification, of which Serlio was a very interesting early victim. But of course, the invention of printing allowed architects to trust images and to use images as the fundamental medium of architecture. And I would argue that I would say that from this moment on, not buildings, not artifacts, but images of buildings, or let's say images related to the representation of architecture, plans, elevations, perspectives, becomes the fundamental medium of architecture, and I would say the very core of architectural knowledge. I mean, today, even today, where we have much more possibilities to travel and to visit buildings, I think we can all admit, without being embarrassed for that most, I would say 99% of our knowledge of architecture is through basically images. You know, of course, in our case, photographs and even videos. But this sort of reification of architectural knowledge through images is a process that starts precisely at this moment, and in a way produce a new form of understanding of architecture, which is not anymore a discipline only for few cultivated patrons or few, let's say, very skilled painters or sculptors who can also become ad hoc architects, but with the mass production, let's say, of architectural knowledge through printed books, creativity itself, I mean, to be an architect is basically mass produced. And there is no doubt that let's say from 16th century to 18th century, these three books, Serlio's 7 books on architecture, Vignola's The Rule or the Canon of the 5 Orders, and Palladio's 4 books on architecture are actually the fundamental textbooks of architectural knowledge, until actually the invention, the dismiss of the classical orders as the main language of architecture, of course, will make these teachings much less relevant. These actually are just, I will be very schematic because I mean, it's almost embarrassing to concentrate in 1 hour a discussion on these 3 architects is almost impossible, so my lecture will be like blocks. These are the portraits of these architects. Serlio, a portrait that might be a portrait of Serlio painted by Tintoretto. This for sure is the portrait of Vignola because this is actually what appears in the frontispiece of his book. And this is actually perhaps the most uncertain of these portraits. At that time, we were not yet in the age of El Croquis, so buildings were more important than the face of the architects. But sometimes they also may have a portrait by a very famous painter, like this one, who is Paolo Veronese. Maybe, we are not sure, and this might be the portrait of Palladio. Very interesting. Palladio, there are no known, I mean, in spite that he's absolutely famous architect also in his, during his life, there are no certain portraits of him as a persona, and actually nobody knows where he was buried. So there is not even a grave. And this tells a lot about the difficulty of Palladio in the last years of his careers. I cannot really tell the whole story, which has been recently reconstructed, which is very interesting and also very tragic also. And this might be also the reason why Palladio felt finally the urge not only to write a book, so to not trust buildings, but something that would be much more enduring his fame, but also for the first time to include projects by himself in an architectural treatise. So in a way, the 4 books, we can say that is, can be also read almost as a kind of personal portfolio of Palladio as an architect. So it's a book not only on the general knowledge of architecture and on antiquities, as we have seen with examples before, but it's also a book that is almost autobiographical. And of course, it has actually a very specific message, which is also, among other possible interpretations, to basically give to the work of Palladio a much more clear and enduring, let's say, reputation. But as in the previous chapters, I would like to stress a bit the context in which these books were written, which is something that is always, in a way, in the background. Of course, for the sake of brevity, I cannot really elaborate this, let's say, this contextual reality, and therefore it might sound very abrupt and a bit cause and effect relationship. But for me, actually, it's very interesting how, and I actually stressed also this with presentations before, there is an interesting symmetry between the rise of architectural theory as something that really can be seen as an encyclopedic attempt, no? to take knowledge and to give knowledge, not only actually knowledge about building, but knowledge about cities, knowledge about customs, habits, and to give it a strong encyclopedic structure on one end, and at the same time, the rise of social and political conflicts. That's in a way where situations in which these habits, this knowledge was questioned, was radically under threat. Last time, for example, I mentioned the famous Tumulto dei Ciompi, a famous short-lived revolution that actually I was thinking about it during this week, and I didn't stress something that is very important when we talk about these events, because we are always used to the idea of a revolution. A revolution, it's a very particular concept, which of course always rise the bar of social change impossibly high. No? We always complain we cannot have a revolution, but in fact that's precisely the problem when we talk about revolutions. The Ciompi and also the event that I'm talking today were not really revolutions, but tumulti. Tumulto means revolt. There is a fundamental difference between a revolt and a revolution. Of course, revolts most of the time ends tragically for the people who actually start a revolt. And the Ciompi revolt, and this one especially, the famous Battle of Frankenhausen, where they ended tragically for the people who were fighting in this, that started this kind of revolts. But, and that's actually very important, they have a very enduring effect in changing our own perception of a particular historical condition. For example, the tumulto threat power, forced power to take measures to reform very often power itself in order to prevent other tumulti, but very often they have a strong symbolic appearance, and the symbolism of a revolt is sometimes even more powerful than the symbolism of a revolution, precisely because it's very intense, is very, let's say, has this kind of sudden appearance, change dramatically the landscape of a particular city. I mean, think of the Occupy movement. Everybody now is saying, well, it failed, they didn't know what to ask, what to do, but at the same time is a movement that has been able to at least change our own perception of certain issues, or even our language. Suddenly certain words becomes very charged with a very specific symbolism, and even the place. I mean, now if you go to Wall Street, you don't think only Wall Street as the space of, let's say, capitalism, but you also think about this counter subject. So that's actually the why I want to raise these events, not as something that, of course, had an immediate or direct relationship with what I'm talking about, but more as these kind of symbolic events, which at that time have a very strong impact and completely change actually the perception of, and sometimes even the language and the habits through which, let's say, things were seen. Now, I want to actually focus on this event, which is the Battle of Frankenhausen, which happened in Thuringia in 1525. So exactly just before the time of explosion, let's say, of architectural theory as a new, let's say, very important activity by architects. This is a painting that you can still see in this amazing panorama that was built during the Democratic Socialist Republic of Germany to celebrate this event, because Friedrich Engels saw that the Battle of Frankenhausen was the first class struggle, one of the first battles which was fought on the terms of class and not ethnic and purely religious belonging. It was led by a very important figure, Thomas Münzer, an allied of Martin Luther, who at a certain point detached himself from Luther, and in fact guided a multitude of peasants to revolt against the lords of Thuringia. This, of course, the event ended tragically, but it had a rather shocking, enduring influence on the mind of people, and especially intellectuals and artists, because for the first time you have the rise of conflicts and struggles which would not clearly be identified within the established canon, of what is warfare or conflict, which is usually at that time was built on the terms of religion or let's say ethnic conflicts. Of course, in the Battle of Frankenhausen, class terms, but also religious terms are mixing. Münzer was, as I said, an allied of Luther. It was clearly a symptom of the way the reform, the Protestant reform was impacting, let's say, the civil society at that time. And just to give you an example of what consequences these conflicts had, and this is actually a clear direct consequence of this famous event. I will just show you this rather enigmatic, curious monument designed by Albrecht Dürer just after the Battle of Frankenhausen, which is actually a monument, a column of victory, a very important celebration, form of celebration, which you can see, for example, in Trafalgar Square, which is usually built after a victorious important battle or war. What is actually strange about this monument is that instead of celebrating the winners, Dürer, who actually is siding with Luther against Münzer, against the peasants that started the revolt. So in a way, the column is supposed to celebrate the winning of the lords against the peasants. But you have to imagine that these sort of new conflicts, new polarizations are not yet clearly articulated. And in the consequence is that Dürer makes this celebration of those who have lost, the peasants, and the uncertainty between victory and defeat is emphasized by the mix of genres that Dürer shows in this column. I mean, the column is really, as we have seen with Vitruvius, the axe of architecture, of classical architecture. It's not just the structural element, but it's also the rhetorical, let's say, archetype. And here we have a rather comic column made of peasant tools, so a kind of mockery of peasant life. And then the peasant stabbed in his back, of course, an image that refers to the famous iconographic theme of Christ in distress. So you have a very uncertain symbolism, which actually mix a comic mockery with a tragic, let's say, rather strange celebration, because of course on top of the column you have rather a defeat figure. So why I want to show you this, this monument is to really introduce the core of the problem that we are addressing today, which is the increasing, let's say, distress of architectural theory, especially architectural theory that comes from a Vitruvian legacy, to cope with these new problems, new conflicts, new ethos, and trying to give to these problems a solvable representation, which of course, as the Dürer monument shows, it's almost impossible without ending up in these rather enigmatic or even grotesque compositions. I want to actually pair the statue of Augustus and our, let's say, Dürer monument to show you actually what is the problem here. With Vitruvius, we have clearly a subject who has taken a mastery and control of an empire and is able, with his rational imperium, epitomized by the gesture of speaking, of addressing a community, to basically rule and construct a cohesive political body. On the other hand, we have this situation where, in fact, power has problems, not only to control this conflict, but also to give them a clear univocal representation. And this is exactly the crux that we will see behind the books, and especially one book that we will see today. As I said, I will give more space to Serlio. Maybe we will even end up with Serlio, so I hope that will not be the case, but I will do my best. I have the clock just in front of me, so I will make sure that we can cover all three authors. First of all, there are many things that make Serlio a breakthrough in architectural theory. The first one, of course, we have just made this point. Serlio heavily rely on images. So he's really not talking to erudites or patrons or princes. Serlio is talking to architects. He's the first author who really speaks a language that is familiar to our own, let's say, profession, the profession of an architect. And in a way, what is interesting is that in a way, Serlio himself is the proto-teacher of architecture, the professor of architecture. Partly because, of course, he had very little chances to build. He built very few things, and perhaps late in his life. So he had, as he himself actually said, a lot of time to be busy, actually, with architectural theory. But the fact that he had actually made that kind of contribution makes clear that, in a way, this new knowledge and the transmission of this knowledge through books is, in a way, a fundamental, it's needed. And somehow Serlio can find a market for it, which in fact will be rather successful. Unfortunately, more when he will be dead, as very often happens to authors. Another very interesting aspect of his work is that he published not all the books in one book, as we have seen before, but he published actually book by book, and not following the numerical order he gave to books. In fact, the first, as you can see, the dates are very important. The first book published is, in fact, the book on the 5 orders, which is published in Venice in 1537. And all the other books actually follow this publication, but not following actually the progressive numbering of them, which is a very interesting strategy because it immediately shows how Serlio is extremely elaborate and articulates in not being completely straightforward in his work. There is always something hidden, something that is, but at the same time, of course, this was a publishing strategy to use each book as a teaser for the other book. So you would read book 4 and you would mention something from book first and second, and of course, while reading the book, you would be eager to wait and perhaps buy the next book. A very also important thing that characterized Serlio's book is that he's the first to theorize the 5 orders of architecture. Until Alberti, the orders of architecture were 3, or 4, like in the case of Vitruvius. With Serlio, actually, a new order is included, the most hybrid one, the composite. But also there is something very interesting about the way Serlio, who is actually the first to really talks about architectural orders as we speak about them today, and the way he understands this famous canon of architecture. While actually for Alberti, the order was not just the column with a fragment of the architrave, of the trabeation as we understand today orders. For Alberti, actually, the type, let's say architectural, what they call architectural type, which is actually architectural order, was the structure, was the structural, let's say, grammar of trabeation column, but seen in its entirety. While actually Serlio is the first to think the order as a fragment, as a piece. This is a very important aspect of his understanding of orders because it gives to Serlio unprecedented flexibility, not only actually to change proportions and to use them in different ways, but also to use them together in always not necessarily orthodox ways, even if Serlio professed himself, unlike Alberti, a big fan, a scholar of Vitruvius. And you have to really, and we will see this with Vignola, you have to really understand that especially in the mid-16th century, when this problem of the Protestant threat to the dogmatism of the Catholic Church is very important, this observation of rules, observation of canons, and especially observation of Vitruvius rules becomes a very sensitive problem, because to challenge the Vitruvian canon is a sort of analogous thing than to challenge basically the orthodox rule of the Catholic Church. And in fact, it's not by chance that in the mid-16th century, there will be precisely in Rome an academy that will study philologically Vitruvius' legacy. So in a way, this Vitruvian canon is experienced almost as a sort of the embodiment of the canon of the Catholic Church against the threat of, let's say, the Protestant reform. And actually, Serlio's role vis-à-vis this threat is quite ambivalent. On the one hand, he professed himself to be a big, strong, rigorous scholar of Vitruvius, and he actually had also come from the group of architects. He's a scholar of Peruzzi, but he's very familiar also with Bramante's work, and Bramante has been one of the most, let's say, intelligent interpreter of Vitruvius. But as we will see in his books, there are clearly signs that Serlio also likes to challenge this canon in a rather, let's say, fundamental ways. And in fact, we will see, especially in the Extraordinario Libro, the extraordinary book, Serlio will, in fact, attack in a very interesting way the hegemony of the Vitruvian canon. Another quality that characterizes Serlio's book is incredible effective layouts, the way he combined text and images. You see here, actually, this is from the book on Antiquities, book 2, and you see actually the rather smart and precise way, but also effective way in which Serlio mix text captions. In fact, in Serlio's, the text is no longer this rather scholar, let's say, today we would say text by Alberti, but it's a very light and sharp captions, but how he mix actually orthogonal projections with eventually axonometries or details in order to really explain these monuments in one, let's say, in the most effective way. Also, a remarkable aspect of Serlio's work is that he's very consistent with orthogonal projections. So he's really trying to master architectural representation to a degree that it can become really a language that cannot leave, let's say, doubt and problems of interpretation. So this, the rise of orthogonal projection is also a very important aspect that characterizes the way Serlio communicates architecture. But I would like to now focus on, for me, the most important book, which in fact is the only, well, one of the two actually that Serlio was not able to publish of the entire collection, and in fact remains in the form of two manuscripts, one in Munich and one in Columbia, the Avery Library, where in fact Serlio deals with the question of habitations. This is really an amazing book because we could almost say that for the first time the problem of housing, not just architecture for churches or palace, which was the way architecture was used till that moment. You have to really understand that very few patrons could afford an architect, to design a project. So the fact that someone is dealing with habitations, also modest habitations, housing, is rather unprecedented because at that time there is not yet a market for an architect dealing with what today we would call social housing. And yet Serlio, who is actually rather sensible, and that's actually also the reason why, among many other, he will go to France to spend the second part of his life, because at that time France is more tolerant towards evangelic and Protestant, let's say, confessions. And in a way, Serlio is a sort of sympathizer. He's close to people that are very eminent figures of Italian Protestant reform. And it's within that kind of ethos, as you know, one of the fundamental aspects of Protestant reform is to emancipate merchants and professionals as a powerful, distinguished economic class within the city. And it's very interesting to see how Serlio, in a way, designed projects in his theatres, which are meant to be for all classes, from the very poor peasant to the very rich merchant, and to the rich citizen. Of course, what is interesting is that architecture becomes very vernacular. You have to think that Serlio designed this book while he's in France, so he adopts a lot of architecture from the place where he's living. The orders, the fundamental canon of architecture till that moment gradually seems to disappear. So in a way, the architecture of Serlio is an architecture that is very much driven by comfort and decorum, a strong quality that Serlio stress in his book, which means meanness, to be mean, to be normal. Serlio really wants to design the houses for normal people, people that are neither, let's say, too aristocratic or too poor to afford even the most miserable, let's say, hut, which of course Serlio designed. But of course, he still is living in his own age. He still has to design also buildings like this, like for example, the house for the prince. It's interesting, in the same book to have the house for the poor peasant and the house of the prince within the same range of possibilities. But Serlio is also a rather pragmatist writer. I mean, he's not imagining like a sort of social utopia where everybody likes each other. And in fact, one of the most comical, interesting moments of book 6 is actually when he, of course, proposed a project for a prince, but why not also a house for the tyrant? And of course, he recommended to build the house in the form of a fortress. So this really shows Serlio's pragmatism, almost in the verge of being cynical and ironical versus the powers that at that time controlled the city. You have to imagine that between the 15th century and 16th century, a lot of rulers have come to power in a totally illegitimate way. And Machiavelli actually stressed this point in The Prince, that one of the fundamental weaknesses for a tyrant is not that he's a bad or an ugly person, but simply that the people he has subjugated are not very, they don't really sympathize towards him. So the tyrant has two enemies, the enemies outside the city, but also the enemies inside his own territory. And so Serlio, who is a pragmatic theorist, a realist theorist, designed also a house for such a figure without any attempt to idealize the rather unstable, uncertain political condition of Italy and France at that time. But what is actually even more curious is the follow-up of book 6, book 7, which is translated in English as a book on situations. What are situations? Situations are the rather bizarre urban conditions in which architecture has to be built. So, for example, in this book, Serlio advised how to unite different properties in one building, but also how to insert a palace, so something that till then was always built as a self-standing construction, completely freed from the context around, within a rather intricate urban condition, which of course has a lot to do with the way, let's say, we could say almost the economics of land division works, produce this rather bizarre off-square sites. So Serlio advised how to adapt the Vitruvian canon to this rather strange and sometimes impossible contextual, let's say, conditions. And he produced a series of plans which are absolutely stunning for their clumsiness and complete distrust for any sense of symmetry and let's say, decorum that was very strong in Vitruvius' idea of architecture, where, as you remember, symmetry is not just a way to organize the building, but it also has a strong symbolic rhetoric about what the building is meant to represent. In a way, these strange sites, these off-square sites, where, in a way, give the opportunity to Serlio to, I would say, almost ridicule the pretensions of a Vitruvian architecture to control the real conditions of the city, where we would say a class of nouveau riche are now able to afford, let's say, architecture. And architecture becomes actually, has to pay a price, which is to basically become a rather bizarre and sometimes grotesque, let's say, form. In the 7 books, Serlio never theorized the project of the city as such. In other words, he never put forward a plan or a cohesive scheme like Filarete, for example, through which to idealize the city as an artifact, like Vitruvius, for example. But in book 1st and 2nd, where he talks about perspective, he creates a series of stage sets which will have a terrible influence in the 17th century theater stage, where in fact he seems to almost put forward what would be the outcome of book 6th and book 7. No? So as usual, Serlio always have this kind of deceptive way to bring a message. No? So I think it's fair to speculate that precisely within the realm of fiction and theater, he finally put forward what would be the result of this crazy city where architecture address all classes. He developed these famous 2 scenes, the tragic scene. Of course, in theater, there are different situations, the tragic and the comic. The tragic scene has this rather centralized space, which is dominated by the gate and the obelisk, and of course refers to the way the street especially becomes a new tool to organize the city within one cohesive, let's say, space. But you see that apart from the street, which is clearly addressed through perspective, architecture becomes rather exuberant and totally freed from any overall design constraints. So there are different styles, different languages can coexist. And then there is the comic scene. And what is interesting is that while the tragic scene it's made of Vitruvian, I mean, not all the buildings, but most of the buildings are made by Vitruvian architecture of columns and trabeation. The comic scene is an occasion for Serlio to really portray with incredible cynical realism what was the city at that time. Now, this totally chaotic agglomeration of buildings, most of them built in a rather precarious way with no sense of proportions, where actually, in fact, the only means of control is the ground, is the urban space, which is very interesting because we introduce what we'll see later on, no? How the order of the city is gradually moving away from the problem of representation and the problem of orders, the problem of facades, as we have seen with Alberti, and moves to basically the realm of space, no? Of basically the managerial control of space, which here is symbolized by this rather Cartesian, almost super studio-like histogram, no? Surface that constitute the very ground of the city. But as I said at the beginning, the most extraordinary, in the literal sense, the most bizarre book by Serlio is the extraordinary book. The book that, in fact, it was not officially intended to be a part of the collection, but that Serlio publishes a sort of PS, as a sort of extraordinary book within the sequence. What the extraordinary book deals with a rather useless and innocent topic, gates. Is a book that is illustrating something like 50, if I'm not mistaken, gates. But these gates are characterized by a rather bizarre and at sometimes frightening compositions. What is interesting is that Serlio makes clear at the beginning of the book that this book is about architectural mistakes. And he said that this is exactly what an architect shouldn't do. So he's clear that the book is showing monstrosities. He really talks about monsters when he address these gates, because they completely deconstruct and hide the purism of Vitruvian language. He proposed, a sort of sixth order, no? Which is neither Ionic or Corinthian or Tuscanic or Doric or composite, but is a kind of bestialized order, an animalesque order, which has no rationality anymore. But what is interesting, the way he explains some of these gates, some of them for Serlio are absolutely mistaken, so they really clearly shows what is wrong in architecture. But some of them have a more ambivalent, let's say, meaning. For example, in these gates where you see a Doric order almost eaten by this kind of, of course, something that with development of Mannerist and Baroque architecture will be very usual. And actually, Serlio will have a lot of success as a theorist. But you have to imagine at that time, this is not really a usual language for architecture. And what he actually, the way he explained especially this gate is very interesting, because he said, well, most of this gate is made by brutal, animalesque, monster-like forms, like natural forms, like natural stone. But once you actually remove this form of barbarism, you really have a pure Vitruvian Doric order. So what is interesting is that we have seen how, for Alberti, the architectural orders were basically a convention, an habitus, were an ornament, and therefore they will always be constructed and artificial, like all social conventions. Serlio go even further with that kind of critique, showing orders which are absolutely unacceptable. By showing actually what the architect shouldn't do, he almost shows the moral of orders themselves, which is something necessary, but at the same time something we can always distrust. And it's exactly in this sort of ambivalence, not to profess an order, and Serlio is not, he doesn't have any sort of fantasy to challenge Vitruvian architecture, but at the same time, he gives us also the possibility to see them as grotesque conventions, something that eventually can become monstrosities, and that nevertheless are important in order to understand what is true architecture. There is an evangelic flavor in this idea that in order to make something good, you have to be bad. That's actually what Serlio is trying to say. You have to actually deeply put yourself in something that is so impossible to accept in order to discover what might be the truth of architecture. And the truth is exactly in that sort of moment, in that kind of ambiguity between what is right and what is wrong, which means that architecture is no longer just a tool to reinforce a certain ethics, in this case the ethics of power, but is also a moment in which ethics can become more autonomous, because they can judge between what is good and what is wrong. And in fact, Serlio leaves this line rather ambiguous, especially in the Extraordinario Libro, where in fact you are never sure, even when Serlio is denigrating a certain example, there is always a little side note of admiration and even interest in doing that particular let's say, rather precarious and not rightful exercise. But a little, let's say, conclusion of Serlio's contribution to architecture cannot avoid perhaps the most interesting, and I don't have time to elaborate as it should deserve this part, most interesting book, which is the one on castramentation. A book that is only drawn. It was never published in a printed form until very recently. And it's a book that trying to reconstruct, based on Polybius' histories, the form of Roman military camps. what is interesting about this book, especially if you see this book parallel to book 6 on habitations, is to see how Serlio reduced the plan of buildings, the plan of, in this case, to very strict diagrammatic, let's say, plans. Of course, there are tents, there are temporary buildings, but this becomes an opportunity for Serlio to employ a language that is exactly the language of modern architecture, the language of diagrams, the language that do not anymore represent architecture in its built substance, but as an organizing device. And in fact, the most extraordinary part of this book is a reconstruction of what's supposed to be a military camp, but Serlio represents it as a city, so with a bath, with temples, with palaces. But Serlio actually represents this plan as a built city. So it transforms something that is temporary, the military camp, in a real ideal city, which actually he developed in details. And the most extraordinary part of the city is this part on housing of the soldiers, which in a way can be seen as one of the first projects of mass social housing. And you see actually the abstraction of this carpet of habitations that have no facades anymore, only corridors, streets, and rooms. So habitation is reduced to its most generic properties, no? The properties of social reproduction. So in a way, the opportunity to reconstruct an ancient Roman military camp began for Serlio an opportunity to summarize his approach to architecture, where in fact organization, housing, management of a new, actually emerging class of inhabitants becomes more important than the truthful representation of an order. So in a way, it's exactly after Serlio that there is this sort of explosion of architectural theory, that architectural theory becomes a specialized genre that involves many practicing architects, but is also, Serlio actually, as I said before, made popular the picture book. The book, the architectural book is no longer driven by a text, by a sort of, it's no longer organized around a story, a clear, let's say, identifiable narrative, like in Alberti's De Edificatoria, which you really can read as a book, as a novel almost. It has a beginning and an end. After Serlio, we really have the practitioner manual, the Architecture for Dummies book. A book that doesn't tell anything if not how to make basically correct Vitruvian architecture. The most important example is Vignola, the Canon of the Five Orders. Unlike actually Serlio, Palladio, but also Alberti and Vitruvius, Vignola doesn't concern about anything if not architectural order, so it's the thinnest book on architecture. What characterizes and what will be important actually for Palladio is that it's the rendering through which Vignola represents architecture, which unlike the very rudimental woodcuts of Serlio are very actually elaborate plates with a very refined actually drawing, which whose resolution was at that time unprecedented. But of course, I mean, what one can see in Vignola is the rise of this counter-reformist ethos, no? Of making rules absolutely important, but at the same time empty. No? I mean, Vignola really embodies this kind of idea of after the crumbling of the architectural canons, you know? There is a sort of attempt to recuperate architectural language in a way that is both strong, very accurate, very precise. Vignola is an extremely talented architect, but is an empty architect. He's an architect who has no whatsoever message, story to represent. And actually, that's the atmosphere that you can feel in his plates of a very refined, precise practitioner, but completely unmotivated by any social or political project that, of course, was never the direct topic of architectural theory, but one can sense that in Alberti's and Serlio there is a project. There is actually an attempt to drive architectural knowledge towards a specific, today we would say vision. Huh? With Vignola that does not exist. Vignola just proposed pure empty architectural form. And of course beautifully drawn, because one should say that Vignola's plates are absolutely fantastic, and they will have, precisely because their refinement will have a huge influence on all architecture till basically the 19th century. And finally, Palladio, the last of the trio, the one perhaps where I should talk the most, but we have very little time, so I will be very short. I will say just a few things. The fact that why Palladio wrote the 4 books. Unlike Serlio and Vignola, as I said before, Palladio was interested to build basically his own portfolio. Of course, he had a strong interest towards Roman architecture, triggered by 2 figures that are behind Palladio's project of revisiting classic architecture, Gian Giorgio Trissino, and especially Daniele Barbaro. Barbaro, together with Palladio, made one of the most refined version of Vitruvius, the Architettura, illustrated by, translated, let's say, edited and translated by Barbaro and illustrated by Palladio. But also you have to imagine that Palladio himself was, on one hand, a very successful architect that happened to work in a rather unstable, uncertain urban context. Venice, Vicenza and Venice. Vicenza, a rather successful mercantilist city in the 16th century, was one of the most violent cities in Europe, especially because Vicenza in the 16th century is the epicenter of reformist culture in Italy. So there are a lot of conflicts, social, political conflicts, which often would stop the builders that would commission Palladio's buildings to stop, to take on hold their projects. I mean, Palazzo Porto perhaps is one of the most pathetic testimony of Palladio's problem, which was he had never seen one of his buildings completed during his life. And this is actually perhaps one of the reasons why he felt the urgency to do something that at that time was absolutely unprecedented, to include his own projects into basically an architectural treatise. The Palladio's books are organized in 4 books. Of course, the 4th book is an introduction, which of course ends with a description of the orders. But the 2nd book is a book where, in fact, Palladio shows along examples from antiquity, also his own buildings, and especially his own villas. Palladio is an architect that have concentrated most of his career in the design of what today we would call real estates, which of course have a strong role at that time, at that moment in the Serenissima Republic, because it's exactly at that moment that Venice have to shift its economic interest from the sea to the land and reclaim the land as a fundamental asset of his own geopolitical power. That's actually why Palladio designed all these villas. These villas have to do with that sort of social and political reform where agriculture becomes a fundamental tool to govern this new territory. Of course, you see how the layout of the 4 books, which by the way is absolutely elegant. For me, it's one of the best books on architecture, not only for its content, but for its graphic design. Very simple, but also very elegant. The text is it's beautifully written, but also the composition text image. No? It's very clear, very clean. No? There is not this kind of little bit messy, let's say, layout of Serlio, but of course, Palladio copy a lot, take a lot from Serlio. These are actually, of course, his villas. You see how Palladio gives to this typology an unprecedented relevance, especially, as you know, the villa, it's a kind of evolution of Serlio's habitations, but what is actually amazing is the combination of a very urban typology, the palace, with a rustic, let's say, barns, the barchessa, So in a way, the villas of Palladio are a strange hybrid between a palace and a barn. And of course, the abundance of loggias really emphasized this relationship with the landscape, which was also a way to frame the people who would live and work within these fields, and especially in the Marquese. So in Palladio's actually building, there is a strong paternalistic message. No? The Lord is in the middle, and the workers are with the Lord. So there is an element of social reform. So the farmers are not longer, peasants are no longer living, no, in some kind of dispersed place, in the countryside, but they live with the Lord, with the patron. They are part of the same building. But at the same time, of course, the patron is in the middle, and of course the pediment, which Palladio is the first to use in a profane building. Well, the very first is Giuliano da Sangallo in the Palace of Paggio a Caiano, but Palladio is very consistent in using the pediment for a house. And you remember in the discussion about Vitruvius that the pediment is really like the symbol of the mastery, of power. In this case, actually, it becomes the symbolize the centrality of the patron that organized these sort of estates, where in fact agriculture becomes the main protagonist, and that's actually why the villa has this unprecedented openness, towards the landscape. For me, actually, the most, this is the last image, the most interesting and powerful, enigmatic in a way, designed by Palladio is the design for Villa Repeta. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore because it was destroyed by a fire, if I'm not wrong, in the 17th century, where in fact the central pavilion disappeared. The villa, it's of course reduced to this rather small pediment. The villa becomes an enormous barchessa, where in fact there is no difference between the peasants, the workers, and the patrons. It is known that the Repeta were strong sympathizers for the Protestant confession, and therefore they had this rather unprecedented welfare approach towards the peasants that would work in their estate. And it's interesting how this, the rise of this new ethos, this new understanding of social relationship, no longer based on aristocracy, but based on economy. And in the end, the villas are productive epicenters, is symbolized by an architecture that we will see much in the next, let's say, chapters, which is purely based on the organization of space, where in fact representation seems to almost disappear. No? So it's interesting to compare the way Palladio ends his book. Well, in this case, he doesn't end his book, but his second book, and the way actually Serlio ends his books on architecture. Serlio ends with this rather tragicomic celebration of the absurd in architecture. So Vitruvian architecture, yes, is important, but at the end we don't know really what to do with it, and the only way we can play with it is to make these rather absurd combinations of genres and forms. Palladio actually, on the contrary, ends his, of course, second book with a building that is purely based on organization, where in fact the problem of representation does not exist anymore because the ruler, the patrons, have in fact left empty that kind of place, the place of representation, and have become embedded in the very way architecture organizes. Something that in fact is unrepresentable, which will be the fundamental asset of Protestant, but later on capitalist ethics, which is basically production. Something that, of course, in the Alberti and Serlio was far more relatively important. But with Palladio, in fact, this idea of production and the way architecture not simply represent, but organize production will be very important. Thank you. There are questions. I know that some of you have to leave because it's 2:03, but if there is some question, I would be very glad to answer. Or comments, or critique, disagreement. This is, as I told you, a rather superficial overview, which I'm sure I think would require much more refinement. So if you have questions, I can elaborate certain rather rudimental passages of my presentation. Yes? You have to speak on the microphone because we are broadcast. It's a part of that reification that I was
How stressful. There is something interesting about the function of Barchesa in Villa Rotonda. I mean, we don't have the plan here, but I wonder if you could say something about that.
Well, in Villa Rotonda, actually, there are no Barchesas.
But there are kind of separated from the actual...
No, Villa Rotonda, there are no Barchesa, I'm pretty sure. Actually, Villa Rotonda is not even mentioned by Palladio in the section of villas, but is mentioned in the section of palaces. And in fact, we call it Villa Rotonda, but it was not a villa. It was a sort of amenity, building for amenity, just next to Vicenza. And in fact, the building has no Barchesa, it's not a productive, let's say, building. So there are no Barchesas. You might confuse maybe with other examples, but for sure, Villa Rotonda actually is not a villa, actually.
There was one, maybe, I'm then confusing it with something else, where Barchesas are completely separated.
Yes, there are, yes.
And then they have completely different function as this, it's a road that leads people into the villa and frames certain views of the landscape. But yeah, anyhow, thank you.
Yes, of course there are different, I mean, I show you only three versions, but yes, Barchesas were not necessarily attached to the main body, the palace itself. They were sometimes detached, but like for example Villa Foscari, but they were always part of the same compound. So this, in fact, actually, you know, when one of the historians that have made Palladio important recently, more than 60 years ago, was Vitruvius, no? With his book on Palladian architecture. And one of the most crucial, let's say, no, actually the book is, of course, Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, which is a book before. And one of the iconic page of that book is this famous page where Vitruvius make diagrams of all the villas not all the villas, but the main villas of Palladio. And one of the interesting things of the diagrams is that Vitruvius does not include Barchese. He only actually make the diagram of the central body, which for me is a very interesting way of reading Palladio's villas, because he almost amputates Palladio's villas of the most important element, which were actually the Barchese. And actually, Barchese is actually where very often Palladio, I mean, apart from this example, does not use architectural orders. He used rather normal, literal columns. Other PhD student? Yes. You are supposed to make questions. I mean, yeah. PhD, because it's a PhD seminar, so I'm supposed to talk to.
I don't know if you can help me. I've been reading Tafuri on Palladio and on Serlio, but sometimes I get confused in his interpretations when he speaks about both in terms of syntactic variability and an ars combinatoria, and, but I can't get for him, or in your interpretation, what's the main difference between the contribution of Palladio as opposed to Serlio's in those terms?
Yeah, I mean, first a little footnote on Palladio's writings, both on Serlio and Palladio, which are absolutely extraordinary. The article, which might be the one that you are reading, is this article on the religiousness of Serlio, which is one of the most important texts by Tafuri on Serlio, which it's a very important text, but has I mean, it shows what was Tafuri's main pleasure in reading architecture, which was his incredible sadic pleasure in choosing architects that would create the most impossible architectural compositions. So he really indulged in this kind of sort of rather bizarre way through which Serlio presents architecture. For me, I think that the problem of Tafuri's reading of Serlio is that it stops there, and it doesn't actually see Serlio in a much larger picture, where in fact this rather bizarre, if not clumsy, approach has a certain narrative, which is very strong, and is a narrative that we see also in embryo in Alberti. On one end, to create a book on architecture means to make a book about the art of government, or governing a certain range of knowledge and tools to govern and represent the city and architecture. But at the same time, there is an element of irony. And irony, of course, is a word that today doesn't mean anything anymore. Everybody seems to be ironic in architecture. But irony, there is something tragic in irony. Irony is let's say well, I would say irony, which is the possibility of detaching yourself from the problem you are addressing, is the precedent of rationalism. In order to be rational, meaning to not be emotionally involved, no, in this, what we have seen with, I mean, the monuments of Dürer really shows that impossibility, no? Dürer is really emotionally involved. I mean, he's one of the first artists to convert to the Protestant reform. You really, I mean, Max Weber, in his book on the Protestant ethics, tells about how there were so many people killing themselves in this struggle dilemma, no? Whether to choose to remain Catholic or to embrace the reform. No? So it was an ethical struggle which was very strong, and Dürer, I mean, the art of Dürer, especially his late work, is really a representation of that. And he ends up by doing these rather absurd monuments. No? Serlio, unlike Dürer, of course, he's also a sympathizer of this new sensibility, but he's also, to use a term by Alexander Nagel, a soft iconoclast. Someone who is always trying to, let's say, clean. I mean, for example, Serlio repeats very often the word simplicity, but not too much. I mean, it's not really, its simplicity is not simple, because you always have this kind of possibilities of sin, let's say, to use evangelic language, but that for Serlios are opportunities to have redemption, which is a very dialectical, very conflictual way to understand the moral meaning of architecture, which I think for Tafuri was very important. Venice, where Serlio actually spent part of his life, is a city, because its mercantilist, let's say, identity, is a city that at that moment becomes actually the harbor of all these people that are trying to contest the moral, let's say, prerogatives of the Catholic Church, you know? For example, people like Pietro Aretino is living in Venice. You know, there are a series of figures that are very familiar to Serlio, and that's actually what really constitutes Serlio's work. I think Palladio is far more straightforward. Palladio is already beyond that struggle, is more operative, and actually Palladio is a sort of resurrection, if you want, of the Brunelleschi's approach, you know? But of course after Bramante and after Serlio. And I think that I think it's clear that Palladio owns a lot to Serlio. Without Serlio, we wouldn't have Palladio. And Serlio is always not recognized in this kind of continuity. But of course, Palladio, unlike Serlio, is far more close to power, in this case the Republic and the patrons, especially the younger party within the Serenissima Republic, which in fact promotes basically his architecture, unlike Serlio, who would have no opportunities, if not very few at the end of his life, to build something. So I think the difference is really about, I mean, Serlio is a strange, I mean, I love Serlio, I mean, it's one of my heroes. He's both tormented and ironical. And I think these are qualities that neither, nor actually, I mean, Vignola is really, is much more talented than Serlio, but doesn't have this struggle. But Serlio had that sort of, which in fact you can see in Palladio. Okay, I think, okay, yes, Umberto.
I only have 7 minutes of recording time.
Okay, so we will be done.
Limit the question as well. It's just, I was just hoping whether you could just sort of maybe reiterate a little bit the last point about the reformist impact on Palladio, and because I'm a little bit unclear also like how this sort of fits in with the whole kind of Calvinist, you mentioned capitalist kind of influence and stuff, and at the same time how in this Repetta you can see how it's kind of superficially sort of democratic, but at the same time
well, I mean, I would say it's not superficially.
Yeah, of course, but like,
I mean, for the standards of that time, this gesture is pretty strong. I mean, of course, there is a paternalism, but architecture itself is always paternalistic. I mean, even when it wants to be democratic, architecture will always, and the more you want to be democratic, the more you will be paternalistic. And for sure, there is an element of that. But this is exactly, I mean, what I think is important to realize, that the clash between Catholicism and the Protestant reform. First of all, this is one of the major events, if not the major event in Western culture, because it's not only about a struggle between two confessions, but it's a struggle between an old form of power mastery and a new social and political ethos that, of course, has to question radically the religious theological framework. And it has a huge impact on both sides. Not only actually, I mean, you cannot say the Protestants, because actually they hated the way religion was very often materialized into objects, so that they promote this kind of idea that religion should not be represented in a way. But they also forced the Catholic counterpart to change, to reform itself, to return to, for example, a much more straightforward form of representation. Actually, the historian was mentioning before, Alexander Nagel, talks about strategies of soft iconoclasm. So in a way, not iconoclasm like, but like this, So to make a villa that looks like a villa, by the way, but there is this kind of attempt to basically respond to these urgencies, to these kind of new mentalities, where in fact this strong hierarchical organization that we see in the other villas was too strong. I mean, in a way, for me, what is interesting is that the villas of Palladios they look very static and hierarchical, but they are the outcome of profound social and economic conflicts, which forced, in fact, the patron. I mean, we always see the power in one direction, but power goes always in two directions, because it's not only the power who is imposing a project, but there is also the power who resists that project. So you can read that in the Villa Emo, for example, that power has centralized, everything is in one body, with the Barchesi attached to the building, But you can read this project also in the other way, that power was forced to accept that peasants, which till then had no whatsoever possibility to find a decent space to live, to be actually accommodated on the same ground of the patrons. So in a way, reform and counter-reform is a struggle where both sides have, whether one is winner or loser, have something to gain. It's an opportunity for them to change and to reform their own language. And of course, Palladio is in the middle of that. But I think that while Serlio belongs to a generation that is still struggling ethically, I mean, there is a strong ethical suffering through Serlio's reflections on architecture. In Palladio, almost this suffering doesn't exist anymore. Palladio has found a way, to tame, to control these struggles in a language that is very stable because its instability and will proliferate for the next 3 centuries, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. Jefferson was a big admirer of Palladio. Okay. See you next week.